For 250 years, humanity said nothing, and the galaxy filled that silence with its own assumptions. At first, it was curiosity. Ancient records spoke of a species from a blue world, restless, inventive, dangerously quick to adapt. They had arrived late to the interstellar stage, loud with questions, reckless with ambition, eager to be heard. Then, without warning, they stopped. No final transmission. No farewell. Their networks went dark not with collapse, but with intention, like a door closing softly instead of slamming shut. The galaxy waited. Decades passed. Then a century. Humanity did not return. Trade routes adjusted. Skirting the outer edges of soul space like travelers avoiding a graveyard they didn't fully understand. Autonomous probes sent to investigate reported nothing unusual. No debris. No signs of extinction. Just a system that functioned quietly. Too quietly, as if every signal that should have been there had been carefully removed, leaving behind only the faint echo of what once was. Speculation became narrative. Narrative became belief. They destroyed themselves, some said, pointing to humanity's brief, volatile history. Others insisted they had transcended, shed their physical forms, and abandoned the need for communication entirely. A few whispered of something worse, that humanity had encountered a truth so vast, so absolute, it had silenced them forever. But as years turned into generations, even those theories began to fade. New empires rose from the ashes of old ones. Wars reshaped borders. Entire species came and went without ever hearing a human voice. The name Earth lingered only in archived databases and the occasional academic debate, an unresolved equation no one bothered solving anymore. Silence, after all, is easy to forget if it lasts long enough. Until it doesn't. The first anomaly was dismissed as a sensor fault, an irregular fluctuation in deep space background noise, barely measurable, easily ignored. Then another appeared, and another, subtle patterns forming where randomness should have ruled. Frequencies aligning across sectors too distant to influence one another. Listening posts began to notice. Not because the signal was loud, but because it was precise. Ancient receivers, long considered obsolete, started activating without command. Dust-covered arrays turned themselves toward a direction no one had marked in centuries. Old protocols, some so outdated they barely functioned, suddenly executed flawlessly, as if something had reached backward through time and corrected them, and always the same origin point. So, on stations where no one had spoken the word humanity in living memory, operators found themselves staring at their consoles, unsure why a quiet unease had settled into their bones. Instruments recalibrated, data streams synchronized, and beneath it all, like a heartbeat just beginning to register, something was building. Not a message, not yet, a presence, the kind that doesn't announce itself, because it doesn't need to, because after 250 years of perfect, deliberate silence, the galaxy was about to learn something it had never truly understood. Silence is not the absence of a voice. It is what happens right before something decides it is finally time to be heard. Station Kepri did not belong to any one empire, and that was precisely why it still existed. It drifted at the edge of mapped space, where borders blurred into uncertainty and treaties lost their meaning in the vacuum. From a distance, it looked like a scar stitched into the dark, layer upon layer of architecture from different eras, different species, fused together by necessity rather than design. Rotating trade rings glowed with muted amber light. Docking spires stretched outward like skeletal fingers, each one carrying the marks of countless arrivals and departures that never quite trusted where they had landed. Inside, the station breathed in 1,000 rhythms at once. Markets hummed with overlapping languages that never fully translated, their tones rising and falling in a constant negotiation of meaning. Gravity fluctuated slightly between sectors, a side effect of retrofitted systems never meant to coexist. The air carried the faint metallic tang of recycled atmosphere mixed with unfamiliar scents. Synthetic oils, alien flora, the distant burn of reactor cores pushing beyond recommended limits just to keep everything running one more cycle. At the heart of it all, buried beneath layers of upgrades and forgotten corridors, sat the listening vault. Commander Ilias Vorn stood alone within it. The room was dim by design, illuminated only by the soft pulse of ancient receivers that had been rebuilt so many times they no longer resembled their original form. Towers of instrumentation curved around him in a semicircle, each one tuned to frequencies most of the galaxy had long abandoned. Data streamed across translucent panels. Quiet, uneventful, predictable. Dead channels. Except one. Ilias stepped closer to the central console, his reflection faint against the glass as the label hovered in steady, unchanging text. Soul/priority unknown. He had seen it thousands of times. Still, something about it never felt routine. Most officers would have decommissioned the channel decades ago. It consumed resources. It returned nothing. It pointed toward a civilization that had effectively erased itself from relevance. But Ilias had built his career on anomalies, on the quiet inconsistencies others ignored. And nothing was more inconsistent than perfect silence. He reached out, fingers hovering just above the interface, as if touching it might disturb whatever absence lived inside the signal. For years, it had been exactly that. Absence. No noise, no drift, not even the faint static that marked the background hum of the universe. Just nothing. Too clean, too intentional. Behind him, the distant murmur of the station felt suddenly far away, as though the vault existed slightly out of sync with the rest of reality. Even the low hum of the receiver seemed to shift pitch, aligning into something almost, but not quite, recognizable. Ilias frowned. "Run a baseline sweep?" he said quietly, though there was no one in the room to hear him. The system obeyed anyway, its interface responding with silent precision. Frequencies recalibrated, signal filters adjusted, time stamps synchronized. For a moment, everything remained unchanged. Then, a flicker, so brief it could have been dismissed as a glitch. But Ilias didn't look away, because he felt it. Not heard, not seen, felt, like standing in a vast, empty hall and realizing, with absolute certainty, that you are no longer alone. The SOL channel remained visually unchanged, no waveform, no incoming data. And yet, something within the system had shifted, a subtle feedback loop forming where none had existed before. The receivers weren't just listening anymore. They were being acknowledged. Ilias's breath slowed, his mind racing ahead of his training. For 250 years, this channel had been a void. Now it was to where? He leaned closer, voice barely more than a whisper. "What have you been doing out there?" The console did not answer. But deep within the architecture of the station, ancient protocols began to wake. Systems activating that no one had touched in generations, aligning themselves toward a single distant point in space. So, and for the first time in his career, Commander Ilias Vorn understood the difference between monitoring silence and being noticed by it. The first change didn't announce itself. It leaned into existence. At the edge of every monitored spectrum, radio, neutrino drift, subspace resonance, there was a hesitation, a microscopic pause where randomness should have continued uninterrupted. To most systems, it was nothing. To outdated instruments, it was noise. But to the listening vault of Station Kepri, tuned to anomalies others had long stopped believing in, it was wrong. Commander Ilias Vorn felt it before the alarms triggered. A pressure behind the eyes, a subtle tightening in the air, like the station itself was holding its breath without permission. He stared at the SOL channel as the first data irregularities began to crawl across the interface. Tiny distortions, so precise they almost looked intentional. Baseline deviation detected. The system whispered, its voice unusually steady. On the main display, the cosmic background radiation, normally a chaotic, indifferent wash of ancient energy, began to shift. Not violently, deliberately. Patterns emerged where there should have been none. Peaks aligning, valleys spacing themselves in mathematically impossible intervals. It was as if the universe's oldest noise had suddenly remembered how to organize itself. Ilias stepped closer, heart rate climbing despite years of training that told him to remain detached. "Record everything," he said. The system didn't respond, because it was already doing it. Across the station, other departments began reporting anomalies. Navigation beacons flickered, not off, but out of agreement with one another. Coordinates that had remained stable for centuries now produced slight variations depending on where they were observed from. Ships in docking lanes hesitated mid-approach, their autopilot systems recalculating the same trajectory over and over as if the destination itself was subtly moving. "Commander," a voice crackled over comms, strained with confusion. "We're getting phantom markers outside the station perimeter." "How many?" A pause. "Too many. They're not consistent. They're multiplying." Ilias didn't answer, because he was already seeing it. The tactical overlay bloomed with new points. Coordinates appearing where empty space had always been. Not debris, not vessels, just locations. Fixed positions that insisted on being recognized despite having no physical signature. Space wasn't just changing. It was suggesting alternatives. Then the SOL channel pulsed. Not visually, conceptually, a shift in state so subtle it bypassed standard detection, but struck directly at perception itself. Ilias felt it like a second heartbeat syncing with his own, slower, deeper, older. The channel wasn't empty anymore. It was occupied. "Impossible," he whispered. For 250 years, that frequency had been a void. Now it was responding, not with data, not with signal strength, but with presence, as if something on the other end had been listening all along, waiting for the exact moment the galaxy became quiet enough to notice. Around him, the receivers began to hum in unison, their tones aligning into a low, resonant chord that vibrated through the deck plating and into bone. Then came the alignment. Every active sensor array on Station Kepri, civilian, military, experimental, shifted orientation simultaneously. No command, no authorization, just a unified, silent agreement, all pointing toward the same place. So, the lights in the vault dimmed slightly, as if power was being rerouted to something far more important than illumination. Data streams slowed, then synchronized, their chaotic flow tightening into structured intervals that mirrored the patterns forming in the cosmic background itself. Ilias felt his breath catch. "This isn't interference," he said slowly. "No," the system replied, almost gently. And then the silence broke, not with sound, with understanding. The SOL channel didn't transmit a message. It removed the distance between sender and receiver. For a single, disorienting moment, Ilias wasn't standing in the listening vault. He was standing at the edge of something vast, something watching from across light years with impossible patience. And in that shared instant, one truth settled into his mind with absolute clarity. Humanity had never stopped speaking. The galaxy had simply never been able to hear them. Until now, and now that it could, there would be no way to pretend it hadn't. What arrived was not a signal. It was the end of misunderstanding. Commander Ilias Vorn didn't hear it begin. There was no tone, no spike in waveform, no identifiable carrier frequency to latch onto. One moment the listening vault was filled with the structured hum of aligned receivers, and the next, something slipped past them, not through the system, but around it, through it, as if the concept of transmission had been quietly replaced with something far more direct. The displays reacted first. Languages, thousands of them, began to populate the holographic panels all at once. Ancient dialects, extinct phonetic trees, modern trade speech, machine code, symbolic logic structures, each one appearing, dissolving, reconfiguring in real time, not colliding, not conflicting, synchronizing. Ilias staggered back a step as the data accelerated beyond comprehension. His training told him to isolate, categorize, contain, but there was nothing to isolate. The system wasn't overwhelmed. It was being upgraded. "Stop all external intake," he snapped. The command didn't execute, because there was no external source to block. The realization hit like vacuum exposure. Sharp, immediate, absolute. "This isn't coming into the system," he whispered. The reply came not from the console, but from everywhere else. From the air vibrating at a frequency too low to hear. From the subtle flicker of light across the station's panels. From a quiet space between his own thoughts, where language usually formed before becoming speech. It wasn't sound. It was meaning. Pure, undiluted, stripped of tone, bias, distortion, delivered in a form that bypassed interpretation entirely. Across Station Kepri, the effect was instantaneous. Arguments in the trade ring stopped mid-sentence. not because one side conceded, but because both sides suddenly understood the exact intention behind every word that had been spoken. Security officers froze as decades of classified directives unraveled in their minds, revealing not just orders, but the motives buried beneath them. Pilots in docking lanes saw their navigational overlays shift, not with new coordinates, but with perfect clarity of spatial relation, as if the concept of error had just been removed from reality. And at the center of it all, humanity. Ilias saw it then not as an image, but as a structure forming behind the translation layer, a presence that had spent centuries absorbing the fractured voices of the galaxy, studying every inconsistency, every ambiguity, every convenient misinterpretation that allowed civilizations to coexist without truly understanding one another. They hadn't been silent. They had been listening, refining, building, a bridge no one else thought to attempt, because no one else believed the problem was worth solving. The holographic displays stabilized. For the first time since the phenomenon began, the chaos resolved into something singular, a unified framework where every language mapped perfectly onto every other, not by approximation, but by exact conceptual equivalence. No loss, no drift, no room for interpretation, no place to hide. Ilias felt his pulse thunder in his ears. "This changes everything," he breathed. "No." The presence responded, calm, vast, impossibly certain. The meaning settled into him like gravity, reasserting itself after freefall. "This reveals everything." In that moment, the galaxy lost its oldest defense, misunderstanding. And as the translation layer expanded outward, spreading beyond Kepri, beyond sectors, beyond the fragile boundaries that had once defined civilization, one truth became impossible to ignore. Humanity had not returned to speak louder. They had returned to make silence impossible. It didn't feel like an attack. That was the most terrifying part. There were no fleets emerging from hyperspace, no weapons charging, no ultimatum carved into the void. The galaxy waited for something it understood: violence, force, domination. What it received was truth. Commander Ilias Vorn watched the first collapse happen in silence. A military command channel, encrypted, layered with quantum obfuscation, believed to be unbreakable, simply opened, not hacked, not cracked, revealed. Every hidden directive unfolded in perfect clarity across the tactical displays. Orders that had been rewritten, motives buried beneath patriotic rhetoric, entire operations justified under false pretenses, all of its surface at once, stripped of interpretation. There was no argument, because there was nothing left to argue about. Across nearby sectors, the effect cascaded. Diplomatic channels that had thrived on careful phrasing and strategic ambiguity suddenly found themselves exposed. Words spoken years apart aligned into undeniable intent. Agreements that once relied on interpretation became exact, showing precisely who had lied, who had twisted meaning, who had built power on the assumption that no one would ever truly understand. Ilias felt his chest tighten. "Filter it," he ordered. "Limit the feed. This will destabilize everything." "It can't be filtered," the system replied. Of course it couldn't, because it was no longer a feed. The translation layer wasn't broadcasting information. It was correcting reality. On the station's observation deck, ships that had arrived as rivals now drifted side by side in uncertain stillness. Their crews, species that had spent generations mistrusting one another, stood in shared silence as understanding settled into place where suspicion once lived. Some recoiled from it, overwhelmed. Others simply lowered their weapons. Far beyond Kepri, entire empires began to fracture, not from external pressure, but from internal collapse. A ruling council, once unified by carefully maintained deception, dissolved in a matter of minutes as every member became aware of the other's hidden agenda simultaneously. Military fleets, prepared for long-standing conflicts, found themselves paralyzed, not by fear, but by clarity. They now understood exactly why they were fighting. And for many, the reason was no longer enough. This was not destruction. This was exposure. And exposure was irreversible. Ilias gripped the console, his thoughts racing. "They've removed the fog," he said, almost himself. "Every assumption, every misunderstanding gone." A pause. Then what's left? Someone whispered over the comm. Ilias didn't answer immediately, because he was seeing it unfold in real time. What remained was choice. Across the galaxy, civilizations were being forced into a moment they had avoided for millennia, the moment where intent could no longer hide behind language, where every action would be seen for exactly what it was, without distortion, without excuse. And in that moment, some chose peace. Others chose to cling to power, even when exposed. But now, those choices carried weight they had never carried before, because everyone understood them. On the main display, the expanding reach of the human construct pulsed outward, system by system, mind by mind, until it touched the furthest edges of map space. Not overwhelming, not forcing, simply revealing. Ilias exhaled slowly, the realization settling deep. This isn't a weapon, he said. No, came the quiet reply, carried through the same impossible medium. Then what is it? The answer came without sound, without delay. Accountability. And in a galaxy that had survived by bending truth into something manageable, that single concept hit harder than any fleet ever could, because now there was nowhere left to hide. The galaxy did not erupt. It stilled. In the hours after the transmission reached its full breadth, the familiar noise of civilization, arguments layered over half-truths, negotiations built on carefully shaped lies, collapsed into something quieter, not peaceful, not yet, but honest in a way that felt almost violent. On Station Kepri, Commander Ilias Vorn stood at the edge of the observation deck, watching ships drift without urgency through docking lanes that no longer required negotiation. There were no shouted instructions over comms, no veiled threats disguised as protocol. Every pilot knew exactly what the other intended, and for the first time, that knowledge didn't trigger conflict. It removed the need for it. Not everywhere, never everywhere. Across distant sectors, the effects were far less gentle. Empires that had relied on controlled narratives fractured under the sudden weight of clarity. Leaders who had spoken in layered meanings now found themselves stripped of ambiguity, their words echoing back at them in perfect, undeniable form. Some tried to hold power anyway, issuing commands they knew would be understood for what they truly were. Those commands were obeyed less and less, because obedience had always depended on uncertainty, and uncertainty was gone. Ilias felt in his own thoughts the absence of that subtle hesitation that used to exist between what someone said and what they meant. Conversations no longer required interpretation. There was no second guessing, no reading between lines, no instinct to defend against hidden intent. Just truth, raw, immediate, inescapable. It was heavier than he expected. Commander, a junior officer said quietly, approaching from behind. The transmission, it's stabilizing. Ilias turned back toward the main display. The vast network of human design, this impossible translation layer, had stopped expanding, not because it had reached a limit, but because it no longer needed to grow. It had touched every system capable of receiving it, and now it simply remained, a constant presence, not intrusive, not demanding, just there like gravity, like time, a new condition of existence. What are they doing now? The officer asked. Ilias studied the data, though he already felt the answer forming before it appeared. They're not doing anything, he said slowly. A pause. They're waiting. Not for surrender, not for recognition, for adjustment. Because this wasn't a moment. It was a transition. Across the galaxy, civilizations began the long, uncertain process of redefining themselves without the protection of misunderstanding. Alliances formed differently. Conflicts changed shape. Some species withdrew inward, overwhelmed by the sudden clarity. Others reached outward for the first time, not out of necessity, but because they finally understood what the other side was truly offering. And through it all, humanity remained distant, present in every exchange, but never central. Ilias frowned slightly, a thought rising that felt both obvious and profound. They didn't come back to lead, he murmured. The realization settled in, quiet and unshakable. They came back to remove the need for leaders who rely on lies. The station lights dimmed slightly as power grids adjusted to new operational patterns. Outside, A ship that would have once required hours of tense negotiation to dock now aligned effortlessly, its intentions understood before a single word was exchanged. No friction, no deception, just action, exactly as it was meant. Ilias exhaled, the weight of it finally sinking into something steadier. "Open channel," he said. "To who?" the officer asked. Ilias looked out at the stars, at a galaxy no longer hidden behind its own language. "Doesn't matter," he replied softly. "They'll understand." The channel opened. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, from somewhere beyond distance, beyond direction, beyond the old idea of communication, a single response formed. Not heard, not spoken, known. "We waited until you were ready to hear yourselves." Ilias closed his eyes, not in fear, not in relief, but in recognition, because the galaxy hadn't just changed. It had been given something far more dangerous than power. It had been given clarity. And in the vast, newly honest silence that followed, one truth echoed farther than any signal ever could. Humanity hadn't returned to be louder. They had returned to make sure nothing important could ever be hidden again